Welcome to Hard Talk. I'm Stephen Sacker. You know things are bad when people are constantly telling you not to panic. And after Britain's Brexit vote, an awful lot of powerful people in Britain and the rest of the European Union have joined the Don't Panic chorus. But how persuasive are they? How confident can we be of the UK's future, or indeed the European Union's? My guest is former Polish Foreign Minister Radek Sikorski. Could British voters have kick-started the unravelling of the EU? Radek Sikorski, welcome to Hard Talk.
Hello.
You said in the run-up to this Brexit referendum that, and I'm quoting you, the entire world will gasp in disbelief if Britain votes to leave. You still gasping?
Well, I think that prediction has borne fruit, unfortunately. Yes, I'm amazed.
But the reason I'm interested in that quote is because it suggests to me that perhaps you and other European leaders and politicians were a little bit complacent. You assumed that in the end the British electorate wouldn't do this.
Well, I think British politicians are equally surprised. Look, you said in your introduction that this could be the beginning of the unraveling of the European Union. I agree, it can't be excluded. That would be terrible for Britain. Also, I think it'll be terrible to have a united Europe to Britain's exclusion, which is something that Britain tried to prevent for 500 years. So, not a good place to be in.
Not a good place to be in, but when you say this could indeed herald the unravelling of the European Union, it makes me think, goodness, the European Union must have been a very fragile project built on sand if the departure of one member state after 28 could lead to people like you saying the whole edifice could collapse.
Well, you can again try to blame the European Union for what has happened, but it's not the European Union that has voted to expel Britain. Britain has voted to leave, and the first duty of the politicians of the continent is to save the remaining Union of 27, and that will be our first priority.
It's just, you know, what sort of message are you sending to the other member states of the European Union and the wider world about the strength and coherence of Europe when you and your compatriot Donald Tusk, who is of course the President of the European Council, say things like this, that Mr. Tusk said the other day? He said, you know, without you, addressing the British people before the vote, he said, without you, not only Europe, but the whole Western and transatlantic community will become significantly weaker. Is that really true?
Well, we will miss you. The European Union with Britain in it was better than what we're going to get now. But you've made your decision. We have to take care of our union. You have to take care of your union.
And we will talk at length about your views as to where your union, the European Union, is going. But I am interested in your take on how you now see the political leadership in Britain. I mean, for example, Prime Minister David Cameron is going to be in office, we believe, for another 3 months or so. He said he must leave. He cannot be the captain of the ship as Brexit is negotiated. But the fact is, just hours from now, he's going to be at a European Council summit where he's going to have to front up in front of the 27 other leaders of the EU nation states. How much anger is there toward David Cameron today?
I wouldn't like to be him at that European Council, because everybody will think that he's to blame, because he called an unnecessary referendum. Yes, he tried to win it, but he tried to win it after decades of unfair criticism of the European Union in his party, including under his leadership. Those decades of misinformation of the British public about how the EU actually works have now borne fruit.
You're describing a politician who, in those terms, you have to conclude, if you believe as you do about what has happened, was fantastically irresponsible and selfish.
Well, he thought that he would not have to fulfill the promise of the referendum because I think at the time he didn't expect to win the next general election. This has been a miscalculation of gigantic, historic, unfortunate proportions.
Another interesting thing I see happening in Europe right now is a great deal of sort of vilification expressed and aimed at Boris Johnson, who, if anybody were the leader of the Leave campaign, it were him. You know him quite well because you went to Oxford University with him. But Boris Johnson has been, for example, by the spokesman for Jean-Claude Juncker, the president of the European Commission, characterized alongside Donald Trump and Marine Le Pen as the horror scenario for the Western world. I mean, is that a helpful thing for European leaders to be saying right now, given the role that Boris Johnson is almost certain to play?
There have been very many unfortunate things said about the European Union in this country. The point is the British people have decided, and that is the fact that we are having to deal with. Which politician said what in Britain, that is a British internal problem.
How very tactful of you. I mean, you know these men very well, not least because you, as I say, were at Oxford with Johnson and indeed, to a certain extent, with Cameron too. You are an experienced European politician. You followed this campaign very closely because you know British culture very well. I just would like you to characterise how you feel, for example, Boris Johnson handled his contribution to the Leave campaign.
I feel extremely disappointed. And with a sense of foreboding about what has happened. They did things that I would like them not to have done, and it's a terrible shame.
Irresponsible?
Look, this is. Let's talk about the consequences of what's happened.
We will. But one final question, because you're almost uniquely placed, because you're a European politician who knows Boris Johnson extremely well. I would say, if one takes the bookmakers as a guide, he is hotly tipped to be Britain's next Prime Minister. Do you think he would be the right man to lead Britain through this Brexit negotiation?
It's not for me to make such a judgment.
You must have an opinion.
I think Europe will deal fairly with whoever your constitutional system throws up as the next leader, just as we will deal fairly with the decision that you've taken.
Interesting you say Europe will deal fairly. It seems to me Europe is split, and here is where we get to how Europe will handle Brexit. For example, even on the very specific discussion of when Britain should trigger Article 50, which will begin the formal 2-year process of negotiating a Brexit, there are divergent views. Martin Schulz, for example, the very outspoken Speaker of the European Parliament, says it has to be now. In fact, he said this forthcoming European Council summit has to be the moment when Britain activates Article 50. Do you believe that's right?
Well, that's politics, and of course people are entitled to their views, and I understand that some politicians in Europe would like this period of uncertainty to be as short as possible. But legally, Britain is in the lead on this. It is up to Britain, I understand actually not even the government but your parliament, that has to activate Article 50 and the process of leaving the European Union.
But it comes back to this point about anger and, to a certain extent, punishment. I mean, for example, French Foreign Minister, Mr. Ayrault, he said the other day, and he seemed to be making a direct intervention into British politics. He said a new Prime Minister must be designated within a few days. David Cameron, of course, said he wants to hang on till October. There are some in Europe who are saying, look, we're fed up with Britain, and Britain can't now dictate the terms of its own Brexit negotiation. We in Europe will start to dictate to Britain. Do you think that is
well? And you're inviting me to interfere and to get involved in an emotional discussion, and I think that's unhelpful because Britain is an important country that we want to have a friendly relationship with. So let us deal with what's happened as competently and as friendly as a divorce can be.
So you would be more of the Angela Merkel school of thought, which says, look, Britain is in a political crisis, we have to recognise that, and we should just give them a little time and space to figure that out before we start making too many sort of demands upon them or telling them how things are going to be.
We are dealing with very important issues for millions of people. And it's unhelpful to some of the emotions that played in your referendum were misplaced, I think. Let's try to deal with facts rather than emotions.
Do you think the European Union as a collective has a coherent plan for the post-British membership
Well,
world?
no, Europe doesn't need a plan because we haven't done anything. You've decided to leave, you have to have a plan.
Well, with respect, surely you, the EU, need a plan too, because you said there's a real risk of the EU project unravelling, so you better have a plan to avoid that.
Yes, but that's an EU business.
I know, and I want you to explore that with me.
And that's why the EU leaders are already going to meet without Britain. Your commissioner has already resigned. The Sherpas before the European Council are meeting already without Britain. One thing is certain. British influence already today, after a week, is less than it was.
It's less, and it already is, in a sense, a totally lame duck member of the European Union.
Yes, because politically you're out. Legally you're still in, but politically you are presumed to be outside of the club. You are not only a member of the club, you are on the committee. But you didn't like the rules, you thought the membership fee was too high, you thought that some of the new members were a bit common, and you've decided to leave. And we will now have to deal with you as a member of the public.
How do you, as a Polish politician who's long experience in government and in EU forums, how do you feel about that absence of Britain? Because Poland, on the whole, has been a very close ally of Britain in many EU negotiations and on many issues. How do you feel about Britain?
Well, look, I was doing in my limited way whatever I could to persuade people to stay, because you are a crucial voice for transatlantic relations, for stabilizing that link, for liberal politics, liberal economics. You are a very important voice also to the balance of power internally in the EU. And that will now be gone, and it's regrettable. That's why I so regret this decision.
I want to come back to that in terms of areas that you care a great deal about, like defence and security. But before we get there, let's just talk economy. There's been so much debate in Britain over the course of this referendum campaign about what will happen to the British economy in a Brexit scenario. It seems, as of today, going back to Boris Johnson, that he believes it will be relatively straightforward for Britain to, in his phrase, negotiate full access to the European single market as part of a Brexit negotiation. Do you think he's right?
Well, that's an aspiration. That's not a plan. In other words, you are saying, I've left the club, I'm a member of the public, but I'd quite like to use the facilities. Well, the committee will meet and will consider the offer. But it's going to be very hard. And this was all known before, because the Norway option, of course, includes freedom of movement of labour.
Yeah, but the argument, if I may, of Boris Johnson and fellow Leave campaigners is, look, let's get real. You know, we've voted for Brexit. You, in the European Union, export 100 billion euros worth of stuff to the UK every year. We are not Norway. We are so much bigger and more important to you. So don't quote to us the deal you did with Norway. Be realistic and accept that you want a deal with us, and you need a deal with us.
We want to trade, but you can trade under different regimes. You can trade under the WTO regime. You can trade under a customs union like Turkey. You can have bilateral agreements like with Switzerland, or you can be in the European Economic Area. Britain needs to propose what it wants, because it's Britain that has taken the initiative to leave.
This is what he actually wrote in a newspaper column as of this very morning, Boris Johnson. Again, we're talking about him so much because he may well be Britain's next Prime Minister. At home and abroad, he says, the negative consequences of Brexit are being wildly overdone and the upside is being ignored. And he says, as the German equivalent of the CBI, their BDI, has very sensibly reminded us, there will continue to be free trade and access to the single market.
Well, I hear BDI has actually already denied saying that. But yes, it's up to whoever becomes Prime Minister to negotiate whatever best deal you can get for yourself. but it's going to be very difficult because at the cutting edge, this referendum was about stopping immigration from the rest of the EU, primarily the stopping of the immigration of people like me, citizens of Poland. Too many Poles. That was, I think, what swung this referendum. So any government that negotiates that deal to satisfy the electorate will need to reduce migration. It's going to be very difficult for the EU to give you a deal that is better than Norway's. And therefore, we have these two tectonic plates approaching each other. And I don't see a good solution.
And just to take Poland specifically, obviously you can't speak for the Polish government anymore. You're sort of out of sympathy with the current nationalist, right-wing, conservative Polish government. But nonetheless, do you think that any government in Poland looking at this would be very tough with Britain because precisely, you're so angry in a sense about what has happened and how your Polish workers in the UK have been used?
You're quite right. I don't speak for the current government. I didn't vote for them. But they were prepared to allow future Polish migrants to Britain to be deprived of some of the social benefits and tax breaks on the assumption that Britain remains in the EU. That deal is now off the table, and I'm convinced they'll fight tooth and nail for the rights of Polish and European migrants anywhere, also in Britain, if Britain is to retain access to the single market.
So bottom line, in your view, there can be no prospect of the UK enjoying full access to the European single market without accepting continued freedom of movement for all European citizens?
Well, I can imagine the Norway option, but that doesn't fulfill Britain's requirement. Any other option is some kind of new relationship between Norway and Canada that would have to be negotiated. Those things take years. And remember that any deal arrived would have to be unanimously agreed by the 27, and also the European Parliament, which sees itself as a guardian of the four freedoms, including the freedom of movement of labor. So with every sympathy in the world, I'm just as an expert telling you that it's hard to imagine.
Let's just think a little bit of what was interesting you said. I'm a Pole in the UK right now. I'm sort of part of the problem. Do you fear the rise of xenophobia? I mean, we have seen in the last 48 hours, we've seen horrible graffiti sprayed on the walls of a Polish community centre in London. We've seen really disgusting messages being left in the mailboxes of Poles in certain parts of the country. How worried are you by that?
Yes, there are these incidents. When you set people, when you wake up those kinds of emotions, some people do horrible things.
What about contagion? Because, I talked about the nature of your government. It is a deeply conservative government in Poland today. It's pretty Eurosceptic too.
Well, it's an ally of the Tories in the European Parliament. What started the whole movement was taking out the Conservative Party out of the European People's Party, the ruling party in the European Parliament.
Well, I suppose the point I'm trying to make is, across Europe, whether it be the Front National in France, the AfD in Germany, a whole host of far-right parties in Scandinavia, Eastern Europe, your neighbourhood.
United States.
Yeah, but they happen not to be in Europe. Let's focus on Europe.
Yeah, but they're having an election soon.
Sure, but the point is, do you fear contagion, that the Eurosceptic, highly nationalist and far-right parties in Europe could benefit greatly from what's happened with this Brexit?
There is a wave of national populism sweeping the entire West, and you're just the latest embodiment, the latest manifestation of it.
So how worried are you about Europe's ability to remain stable?
I'm worried, and you haven't helped. You've made it worse.
Again, suggests to me there is a fundamental fragility at the heart of the quote-unquote European project.
Of course there is. Like all human institutions, and they depend on consent, on emotions. and bad emotions have been given free rein.
So where
and
next?
Have been encouraged.
Where next for the European Union? Again, clearly in the last 48 hours there have been different comments from different European leaders, some saying the message of Brexit is that we've accepted too much federalism, there's been too much Brussels, and we have to back off from that whole integration
actually,
process.
Britain had an a la carte membership. You were not in the single currency, you were not Schengen, and still you decided that it's not good enough.
But the Czech foreign minister, for example, he said that the lesson of what has happened with Brexit is that this is Jean-Claude Juncker's fault and the federalists' fault.
Well, I disagree with that. The point about we also remember we had two referenda in Holland and France, which started this wave of questioning the European project, which brought down the project of a European constitution, which would have made Europe more transparent and more democratic. Europe is built as a confederation. We agree rules jointly in Brussels. Listen me out, because this is important. Nobody is imposing on member states anything from Brussels. This is member states coming together and agreeing rules, which the European Commission then enforces. And we let member states enforce those rules, whether it's the rules of the single currency or the single area of movement, Schengen. And the point is that some member states are either unwilling or unable to enforce those rules or cheat. And that's why there are so many problems with the governability of the European Union.
But those member states ultimately are all democracies, they're answerable to their people. Would you accept that today across Europe the public mood is to back away from ever closer union, to jettison that, consign it to history, and to find a way of actually making the European Union a much looser association of nations?
I think that you've been a victim in this country of 30 years of anti-European press and politicians who were not truly taking responsibility for decisions that they were themselves taking in Brussels.